In 1987, a man stood up in a Manhattan ballroom to address the investors of one of America's largest aluminium companies. The room came expecting the usual liturgy: margins, synergies, shareholder value, the whole grey catechism of quarterly earnings. Instead, the new chief executive, a man called Paul O'Neill, told them he wanted to talk about worker safety. His intention, he said, was to make Alcoa the safest company in America. 0 injuries. The audience was baffled. One investor reportedly rang his biggest clients that very afternoon and told them to sell the stock immediately. The board, he said, had put a mad hippie in charge. It became one of the worst calls of his career. Within a year, Alcoa's profits hit record highs. By the time O'Neill retired 13 years later, the company's market value had risen roughly 5-fold. And along the way, it had become one of the safest employers on earth. Now, here's the part that belongs on this show. O'Neill hadn't abandoned profit for principle. He'd made a bet about mechanism. To get injuries to 0, every plant had to understand why injuries were happening, which meant studying every single process. And fixing dangerous processes meant fixing sloppy ones, because it turns out they're usually the same processes. Reporting injuries within 24 hours forced managers to build communication lines that then carried every other kind of information. Workers who watched the company spend real money on their safety started offering the cost-saving suggestions they'd been sitting on for years. One priority, pulled hard enough, dragged the entire culture along behind it. Charles Duhigg told the Alcoa story in his 2012 book, The Power of Habit, and he gave this pattern a name that has earned its place in the language. The Keystone habit. In an arch, the keystone is the single stone that holds every other stone in place. Some habits, Duhigg argued, work exactly the same way. Change that one, and change ripples outward through behaviors that look completely unrelated. Before I build anything on that idea, let me do what I always do here, which is check the foundations, because I owe you honesty about the evidence. Keystone habit is a journalist's synthesis. It's not a laboratory construct. You won't find a controlled trial that randomized people to keystone habits versus ordinary ones. Duhigg built the concept from case studies and adjacent research. So, hold it as a pattern well worth knowing, not a law of nature. But the adjacent research is real, and it points the same way. The organizational psychologist Carl Weick, in an influential 1984 paper on what he called small wins, argued that large problems are best attacked through small concrete victories, because each win reshapes what people believe is possible and recruits allies for the next one. Studies of exercise repeatedly find spillover. People who start training often begin, entirely unprompted, eating better, sleeping more consistently, reporting they're getting more done. The new habit seems to drag its neighbors along, and research on self-regulation has found that practicing small acts of discipline in one domain can improve your regulation in others. The mechanism underneath all of that, that's the interesting part. So let's open it up. 3 engines seem to drive the ripple effect, and knowing them is what lets you pick a keystone rather than just any old habit. The first engine is identity evidence. Every behavior you repeat is a quiet vote for a version of yourself. And some behaviors are far louder votes than others. Run 3 mornings a week, and the identity update isn't, I run. It's, I'm the kind of person who keeps promises to myself. And that belief does not stay in its lane. It shows up when you're deciding whether to prep tomorrow's lunch, or open the invoice pile, or have the difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Keystone habits are the ones that generate general-purpose identity evidence. That's why they punch so far above their weight. The second engine is structural. Some habits mechanically reorganize the day around themselves. A morning run requires an earlier night, which ends the late scroll, which improves your sleep, which steadies your mood, which lowers the 4 o'clock sugar raid. Nobody willed those 5 changes. The first one implied all the rest, the way O'Neill's safety pledge implied process reform. So, when you're weighing up a candidate Keystone, ask what it forces. The best ones have demanding logistics. That's not a bug, that's the transmission system. And the third engine is momentum. Wake's insight again. A concrete win changes your assessment of what's winnable. The first week of a kept habit produces something subtle and genuinely priceless. The felt experience of your own agency, working. People routinely describe one successful habit making everything else feel suddenly doable. Nothing succeeds like a small success. So, which habits actually do this? Certain ones show up as keystones so consistently in Duhigg's reporting and in coaching practice that they deserve naming. And notice what they have in common. None of them is impressive in itself. Everyone is a loud identity vote with demanding logistics. Exercise, the most reliably documented, its ripples reaching sleep, food, mood, and confidence because it touches both body chemistry and identity. Sleep at a fixed time, unglamorous, and arguably the most structurally powerful of all because every other habit runs on the energy budget it sets. A shared daily meal, family dinner. Duhigg cites research linking it to a whole spread of good outcomes for children, not because the food is magic, but because the ritual structures the evening and the relationships around it. Making the bed, the comedy option, except it isn't, because it's the day's first completed promise, 30 seconds after waking. Pure identity evidence, at almost zero cost. Tracking, food diaries, spending logs, training journals, because recording a behavior changes the behavior, and the habit of noticing generalizes ferociously. And a 5-minute morning planning ritual, deciding the day's one priority, which converts a whole day from reactive to deliberate. Now, the practical heart of all this, because most people choose habits the wrong way round. They pick the symptom that bothers them most. I snack, so I'll stop snacking. I'm disorganized, so I'll buy a planner. A Keystone search runs completely differently. You ask a single sharper question. What one change would make 3 of my other problems easier without my touching them? Work it through on paper in 3 moves. First, list your 5 most annoying recurring failures. Honestly, the late nights, the skipped workouts, the chaotic mornings, the 3 o'clock crash, the side project you never open. Second, hunt for the upstream node. For each failure, ask, what does this depend on? And follow the arrows backwards. When several arrows converge on the same point, and it's usually sleep or exercise or the sheer absence of any planning ritual, you've found a candidate. Third, check it against the 3 engines. Would keeping it be a loud identity vote? Do its logistics force other changes automatically? And is it winnable within a week or 2, small enough to actually deliver that first small win? Here's something worth sitting with. The Keystone is very often one step upstream of the thing you keep failing at. Picture someone who spent years trying to fix their mornings directly, the routines, the intentions, the 5 a.m. fantasies, and failing every time. Why? Because they were legislating for a person who went to bed at 1 in the morning. Fix 10:30 at night, and 6 a.m. fixes itself without a single further decision. And then, this is the discipline that separates the Keystone strategy from ordinary new leaf enthusiasm, install one. Only one. Because the entire logic of the Keystone is that you don't need to fix everything. The ripples do the fixing. Attacking 5 habits at once isn't extra credit. It's a rejection of the premise. And it fails the way all fronts everywhere wars fail. So pick the Keystone. Shrink it until it's almost trivial to start. Bolt it onto something that already happens in your day. Clear its path of friction, and then give it 6 weeks of boring, unheroic repetition. So here's your drill for tonight. 10 minutes, 1 sheet of paper, 5 recurring failures down the left. Draw the dependency, arrows backwards. Circle the point where the most arrows meet. Write the 2-minute starting version of that one habit and the daily anchor you'll bolt it to. Sentence 1. After I do the anchor, I will do the tiny keystone. Sentence 2. Because identity is the engine. This makes me the kind of person who... And then watch. Over the following weeks, watch for the thing Duhigg's concept predicts, and no to-do list ever delivers. Changes you didn't plan, arriving on their own. The earlier nights you never scheduled. The better lunch you never decided on. The invoice pile that somehow got smaller. That's the keystone, settling into the arch. One stone placed deliberately, quietly, holding up all the habits you'd stopped believing you could build. Real change isn't magic. But choose the right stone, and it can look remarkably like it. If this landed, join the Rebuild newsletter. That's where I go deeper on the mechanisms behind all of this, one practical email at a time. This episode was narrated by an AI clone of my own voice, trained on this show.